Hello everyone and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today I'm going to be doing my round 20 AFL Power Rankings video. I'm going to be going through every team and ranking them from 18th all the way to first. It's going to be over essentially a 4-week block, talking about how each team has fared over those weeks since my last round 16 video. Now, before we get into it, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to my channel, if you do like this type of content, it's going to be a lot more coming your way and it'll really help grow my channel, as well as if you wouldn't mind leaving a like on the video, as it'll really help push it in the YouTube algorithm. But with that being said, let's get straight into the video.
It came up behind him like a librarian. Jesus!
In 18th spot, I have the West Coast Eagles. Pretty obvious that they've been 0-4 in this time span. I think they're actually 0-8 if you take before this. And their form is losing to the Demons by 54 points. They then sacked Adam Simpson and then put in Jared Schofield as the interim coach. They lost to the Lions in a much better performance by 13 points. Lost to the Saints by 12 goals, a really poor performance. And then just lost to the Dockers, where they started really well and then faded, losing in the end by 35 points. They have dealt with a fair few injuries, obviously like the West Coast Eagles do over the last few years. They've lost Duggan, McGovern, and a few others, including Waterman, during this time, and players like Harley Reid, ever since he probably got suspended, haven't had the same form that they had right at the start, where West Coast looked to be much better. That's why they're 18th, but they are ever so slightly above the team that I have at 17th, which is Richmond. Their form is losing to Freo by 51 points, losing to the Giants by 24 points, losing to Port by 41, and losing to the Pies by 26 points. The reason they're above the Eagles, even though they're both 0-4, is because I think that Richmond have been in games for a bit longer. They're probably much better over 3-quarter period, you can say, where they pushed the Power for most of it. They pushed the Giants as well for most of it. And then aside from the first quarter against Collingwood, they were basically level the entire game. That's why they're 17th, because even though they've dealt with some injuries, I think some of their performances have been a bit stronger, but still not much to say with these two teams. Team I have in 16th is North Melbourne. Just excuse my doggy back there. I like sitting on my bed. The reason I have North in 16 is if you look at some of their form, they've put some pretty good performances in. They beat the Suns by 4 points in what was a pretty big upset. They lost to the Swans by 79, but at that stage, Sydney weren't genuinely on the downfall. Lost to the Blues by 19, and then just lost to the Cats by 40 when they were in it for most of the 3 quarters. Now, their midfield has been pretty good so far this year. Tristan Cherry has led that alongside LDU, Sheasel, players like Jai Simpkin and Tom Powell probably making up most of it. They've been pretty good, especially in the back half where Clarkson has focused on a more stoppage kind of game, and they've really hurt teams in the middle. Sheasel's probably had an All-Australian year. LDU has certainly had a few 3-vote games, and Tristan Cherry's probably been the 4th best ruckman potentially for the year. But outside that, their forward line has just been very inconsistent. Largy hasn't had the top 3 Coleman year, but Zerha and Curtis have been relatively effective. It's just finding another genuine key forward. And then their backline, obviously, we know the struggles they've had. That's why they're 16th. Definitely better than the bottom 2, but nowhere near the others. The team that I have in 15th is Essendon. They've had a huge drop-off from, I believe, 2nd on the ladder or something. So that's a big difference. Yes, they played some worse teams early on, but still a top 4 team should never fall this quickly and this badly. Their form reads as beating the Pies by 12 points, but now that we know the Pies aren't as good as they were, that doesn't look as such a good win. They lost to the Demons by 17 without Max Gawn. They lost to the Crows by 2 points in a big upset where they were up by 3 goals pretty late in the game, and then got torched by the Saints by 53 points in a huge upset game. Essendon looked to be on the very similar trajectory that they were at the back end of last year, where they start really well, pretty close to top 4 for a fair few weeks, and then really drop late. Last year, they had a couple teams where they could beat. This year, post-bye, it's only been Collingwood and the Eagles. And so They've got Fremantle coming up this week. If they don't win that, they're definitely not making finals. And I just don't see it in them. They've got Merritt, who's leading from the front, as always, really well. But outside of that, there's just really not much. It's a lot of passengers. You've got players who just aren't living up to expectations. Ben Mackay gets paid 1.4 million or something this year and is making very simple handball mistakes. And it's just not finals caliber. I think there's a fair few things that need work in the offseason. Brad Scott probably knows that, but the fact that he even got them in top four is probably a bit surprising this year anyway. In 14th spot, I have the Adelaide Crows. Their form reads as losing to the Lions by 11 points in a good performance up at the Gabba. They beat the Power by 14, so not they beat the Saints by 32 at the Adelaide Oval, beat the Bombers by 2, and then they just lost to the Hawks by 66 points. The Lions game, they were it was pretty back and forth for the most part. Rankin, this was the game he got suspended, so he's missed the last three. They were able to get a very comfortable win over the Saints, especially in the last quarter, in a pretty rainy and dour affair, where it was basically tied for the most part before the fourth. Phil Thorpe came on and had a huge impact, and it was able to get the crowd into it and got the game over the line for the Crows. Rochelle obviously kicked the winner in a very momentum-based game against Essendon, where they were down by 15 or something with 7.5 minutes to go, and then were able to get the win, which is really impressive. And then they just lost to the Hawks by 66. Again, this one was without Dawson, without Rankin, and they just showed that how important those two are to their team. Aside from that, I think their forward line has certainly struggled. Fogarty has not hit that leap and taken those steps that some thought he would, especially for the last few years. Phil Thorpe obviously hasn't been there for most of the year, but I think there's a few things good with their backline. You look at players like Mitch Hinge and Josh Roll, I'm a huge fan of those. But outside of that, their key positions just haven't really locked down their spots. But I think a young player like Michelini could really break out next year and potentially become one of the best lockdown smalls in the game. There's things to like about Adelaide, but there's just a lot of inconsistency in their game, which you can see with some young teams. In 13th, I have the Gold Coast Suns. They're obviously pretty inconsistent. We know that with their form home versus away. Their four recent games are losing to North Melbourne in a bad game by 4 points. They beat the Power by 14. They lost to the Giants by 39 and lost to the Lions by 28 in the most recent Q clash. That obviously is inconsistent. They beat two um, they lost to a team who they shouldn't have lost to, beat a team who they probably in the same level when they're at home, and then lost to two teams that they should have lost to. Brisbane actually probably shouldn't have lost to given their injuries in the back line, but they kicked in accurately in those last two games, and that obviously didn't help. They're trying to push for finals, but it just looks like they're a bit too inexperienced at the moment, making some silly errors. And obviously, there's a big difference in form between them home and away. I think they need to find a partner alongside Ben King if they want to make finals this year because there's been a fair few changes. Ethan Reed, Jed Walter, Jack Lukosius has been there for most of the year, but they've also had to play Sam Day and Levi Casbolt, more experienced players, probably fit slightly better, but they've also had some injury problems. I think Gold Coast have the talent to make it. There's something there that they need to fix, and I think Hardwick has the ability to do it, and he probably has the talent on the list to do it. It's just I think they need a couple more years to really get into the game. At 12th, I have Collingwood. They are the reigning premiers, obviously, and have had a very difficult year, especially with injuries. They have lost to the Bombers by 12 points. They lost to the Cats by 20 and then lost to the Hawks really, really poorly by 11 goals, where they just looked off it from basically the first bounce. And then just got the win over Richmond by 26 points. But at this stage, you should always be beating Richmond if you're one of those teams that are above, let's say, 14th or 15th. I think there's a lot that Collingwood still need to improve on. Obviously, they need to get some players back, but you saw how Cox, like someone just like him and McStay, can be structurally to them. Obviously, the loss of Murphy really affected Darcy Moore because he's had a very poor year, but also their midfielders has had a big dip in form. Players like DeGoey, who's been very in and out of the team, Mitchell the same, and there's been a lot of reliance on Nick Dacos to get the job done when he just hasn't probably been able to be that player and be that one to rely on every week consistently because he's had to perform to such high levels. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to make finals as well because they've got such a tough draw. But if they do, they're going to be a really difficult team to beat, and they should have some players back by then as well. The team that I have in 11 is St Kilda. They beat the Swans in a big upset by 2 points. They lost to the Crows by 32 in a disappointing game where they just couldn't play in the rain. They beat the Eagles by 72 and then just beat the Bombers by 53 points. This is, I think, the first time in like 8 years where the Saints have won 2 games by 50 points in a row. And they have potentially just started to find their form with their scoring ability. It's obviously been a huge criticism under Ross Lyon, but it's more so been their ability to convert A in front of goal and B when you make the turnover in the forward half. That's been the problem. It's never been the ball movement. They have got some really good statistics behind them, probably since around 12, I think, where they were top 4 rated. And that shows that there's still some good form. The main question for them is can they fit Max King back into this and continue this same sort of form for next year? That's what it's about for St Kilda. It's about how they can do this next year, build into the season, and potentially get 2 top 6 picks by the end of the year and use that to draft some really good midfielders, which they need. At 10, I have Melbourne. They have beat the Eagles by 54, beat the Dons by 17. They lost to Freo quite poorly by 50, who seemed to be their bogey team, and then they just lost to the Giants by 2 points. They are sitting just outside the 8, I think 12th, if I'm not mistaken, and they're pretty close to that in my power rankings. I just think that obviously they didn't have Max Gorn before this Giants game, lost Petrarca earlier in the year, and if you don't have those two, I don't think they're much a chance of winning, but they still beat Essendon, which show there's something on the list. Obviously, they've had Trent Rivers become a much better midfielder without Petrarca, and the big question is surrounding Clayton Oliver at the moment. His form has been nowhere near his best, and it's whether they want to potentially move off from him. I think it's a question whether they want to go young and have those older players surrounding them at the end of the year, or if they really want to push for a premiership. I don't think they're good enough to win it this year, and so it's what they choose to do at the end of the year, where even if they do make finals, where can they go from there? The team that I have in ninth is Carlton. They are sitting just outside the 8, where considering, what was it, 4 weeks ago, I think I might have had them number 1, potentially even number 2. So it's a pretty big drop off. They've lost some players to Koning, McGovern, um, some really important pieces to them. But the big problem is obviously that midfield, it hasn't been as damaging. It hasn't been as physical as it was. And if they're which it's their one wood, so if they're not absolutely whacking teams in the middle, similar to what Fremantle have done this year, then their game is going to be nowhere near their best. I think a big reason to that is probably De Koning because of how good he was during that middle stretch of the year, and Pidnet just probably isn't a number 1 ruckman anymore. And I think that with their form where they have lost to Port by 14, they just got past North Melbourne, lost to the Dogs by 14 and lost to the Giants by 12. There's not too many worry signs because it's 3 teams who are probably sitting in the 8 by the end of the year. But I just think that the way they need to play probably needs a slight change where they're a bit more freed up for in the forward half, be able to find some more targets outside of just Kerno and Mackay, as I think that'll really help them become finals, where Kerno hasn't necessarily proven himself as a top player yet. Kicking off the top 8, we have Sydney, who have slid pretty hardly. They have not been in some great form. They lost to the Saints by 2 points, where they could have won it had they kicked accurately, beat North Melbourne by 79 in a pretty good response, but then they lost to the Lions by 2 up at the Gabba, so not obviously much panic about, but then they got hit hard with injuries, and they then lost to the Doggies by 39 points in a very poor performance. Now, I think that there's some validation to the criticism, but there's also a lot due to injury. They have some players who, given how crazy they performed in the first half of the year, have obviously come back. Players like Warner, players like Heaney. I don't think Blakey is that kind of player just yet. And he's still been very good, don't get me wrong. but I don't think he's a genuine All-Australian lock this year. Um, I think that there's some improvement that they need to make with their key forward structure. Marty hasn't had anywhere near as good a performance as he was against Adelaide, where he kicked 9 goals. I think he's had 5 goals since then. Um, Logan McDonald hasn't been that breakout star that some thought he would have, and Hayden McLean hasn't hit the scoreboard as consistently as he was in the first half of the year. They're now dealing with some injuries in the back half of the ground as well. Rampy's out. I believe Melican might be out now, and that puts a lot of pressure on Tom McCartan, and it's just whether he can hold up. So I think Brodie Grundy's taken a bit of a step back in his form, and it's just everything's sort of not fallen to bits, but there's definitely some cracks starting to show in Sydney, which is why I have them all the way down at eighth compared to their crazy start of the year. Now, there was a big cluster of teams for me from seventh to second, and that includes Geelong, it includes Dogs, Freo, the Giants, and the Power, and I believe Hawthorn as well. And I genuinely probably spent 10 to 15 minutes deciding on who and where I think these teams belong. The team that I have in seventh, however, is Geelong. Their form line is probably one of the weaker if you compare them all. They have beat the Hawks by 51, which at that stage wasn't considered a crazy good performance, but it's still a good win. They beat the Pies by 20, which in hindsight, when they beat them, isn't a crazy good win either. They got smacked by the Dogs, which is a big reason why they're seventh for me. And then they beat North by 40. I think you could scratch out the North game as nothing crazy. So you take a look at it. Yes, they beat the Hawks, but they got smacked by the Dogs, and then they beat the Pies by 20. So it's nothing outrageous, but just good enough to sit at seventh. Over this stretch, obviously their midfield hasn't been fantastic, but they've been a bit more consistent than what they had. Their rucks are obviously a big question, as always, with Geelong. But I think a mix between De Koning, Blitzarves, and I don't think it's been Stanley or Conway. It's probably been Shannon Neal as the backup rockman, and he's been all right. Their forward line has been a lot more electric, and they found a solution with players becoming more aware of Tom Stewart, and they found a solution with him playing essentially as a CDM in soccer, where he sits just off the back of the stoppage most times after rolling back. And it's worked, and teams haven't always been able to stop him in most recent weeks. In the team that I have in sixth is the Giants. They are 4-0 and one of only two teams, I believe, to actually be 4-0 in this stretch. However, they beat the Blues by 12, which is a good result, beat the Tigers by 24 in what wasn't a crazy strong performance by any means, but just an expected win. They beat the Suns by 39, although the Suns did kick it inaccurately, which is probably why I don't have it as a crazy good win. And then they just snuck past the D's by 2 points. The reason why I have them at sixth is just because I think their form hasn't. Sorry, not their form. Their play style hasn't necessitated a top four result. I think the reason why they were so good at the back end of last year is different as to why they are here now. Hogan has been fantastic for them. I think he's second in the common, only three behind Kerno. But aside from that, I don't think there's been crazy good individual performances from a lot of Giants players this year. He's been their probably best and fairest so far. And outside of that, I don't think anyone's really performed to their best level like they did last year. And so there's certainly room for improvement. And if they do come with a big streak like they did at the back end of last year, watch out for them in finals because they've shown their playstyle works. It's just I don't think their playstyle has been the same as it was last year, hence why they are sixth. In fifth spot, I have Port Adelaide. They are 3-1 in this 4-week period, and they have beaten the Dogs by 54 points, which was a very impressive and pretty surprising result, especially at that time. They lost to the Suns by 14, but also that was up at Gold Coast. They beat the Tigers by 41, where they really broke the game open in the last quarter, and then got a really impressive win over the Blues by 14 points. In the game against the Blues, their pressure and their tackling was probably the most significant part of their game. I believe it was like 90 tackles or something crazy, which in this day and age you very rarely see. And so huge shout out to probably Ollie Wines and Willem Drew leading the front in that scenario. Port Adelaide obviously really like to press high. They like to get the ball in their front half and lock it in. and Moss, they do tend to be susceptible to scoring. They were able to keep Carlton to only a goal after half time, after being down by 5 goals at half time themselves. So it was a really impressive and probably very important win for the Power. And I think they're probably favourites to make the 8 at this stage and potentially fight for a home final in the elimination final. I think a big reason for them getting the win was probably moving radically forward. It had been a bit of a iffy solution to him being a backman, with Ali probably being too similar. And so playing him forward over the likes of Dixon and Finlayson potentially could have saved their season in a sense where they're able to get this win that many people wouldn't have predicted. But that's why I have them fifth, just outside top four, because if they were really this sort of team, then they probably wouldn't have lost to Gold Coast up at Carrara Stadium. The team that I have in fourth is actually Hawthorn, one of the biggest rises this season, pretty obviously. I believe they've won 11 out of 13 now at this stage, or something along those lines. Their form line reads as losing to the Geelong by 51 points, which is obviously a bit of an outlier at this moment. They beat Freo by 13 in Tassie, beat the Pies and the Crows both by 66 points in some really impressive displays. Their energy and their passion that it brings to the game, it's something a lot of other teams can't match. They have really good small forwards. The mosquito fleet that a lot of people say it's really, really difficult to stop, and something that they bring to the table out of a lot of other teams don't have is their ability to draw free kicks, specifically high contact free kicks inside forward 50. They have doubled the amount the next team has with 20 compared to 10, and that can be a real point of difference for teams to be able to try and stop, as a lot of them haven't so far this year. Now, the reason that they're probably not top two at the moment with their 10 out of 13 wins or whatever it is because they do have the outlier game where they lose to Geelong by 51 points. I also think that their forward line probably isn't as damaging at times, and their back line is certainly susceptible to scoring. But their midfield has been exceptional this year. Meek's been fantastic, especially probably since the post-bye, similar to what Kieran Briggs did last year. Will Day has been fantastic since return. James Warple's had a very good year. Nash, Newcomb, Ward, Mackenzie, all on the outside as well, have been fantastic. And that's the real reason why they have been so good in the back end of the year. The team that I have in third is Fremantle. They just miss out on second spot for me, but their run in the last 4 weeks look like beating the Tigers by 51 points. They lost to the Hawks in Tassie by 13, beat the Demons by 50 in a very impressive display, and then just got over in the second half against the Eagles by 35 points. Their forward line has certainly been pretty good this year. Tracy and Amiss have been very strong key forwards. Tracy's probably been the better of the two, but he just has been really physical and has been a real improver so far for them this year. Their midfield has probably been their best part. I think that their clearance dominance has been almost second to none, especially over the last 10 years. It's genuinely some insane statistics, and I don't know if it's sustainable for finals, but it's a wait and see now because it's a different style to how they played in 2022. Their backline has also been very good with a fair few injuries. Obviously, Brennan Cox missed a lot of to the start of the year, and now they're missing Alex Pearce for the back end. And players like Luke Ryan and Jordan Clark have really helped carry the load, and they've been fantastic. They freed up their ball movement and allowed Hayden Young to go in the midfield, and he's had a very, very good year. And they've played a bit quicker and been able to move the ball a lot smoother than what they have in previous years, and that's allowed them to finish pretty much top four for the end of the year. I reckon they'll finish probably just outside of a home final, which is why I have them third. The team that I have second is the Bulldogs, and their form is actually very respectable. They have beaten now after losing to the Power by 54 points. Obviously, they beat the Blues by 14 in a very, very impressive game where Jamari Ugle-Hagan really struggled early, but then worked his way into the game, was able to find how he was getting stopped, and then work his way around it, showing some real fight in him, which I probably don't think I've seen from him before. They beat the Cats by 47 down at GMHBA in a really strong showing with players like Treloar having fantastic games. Ugle-Hagan again. He's been really impressive over the last 3 weeks. And then obviously on the weekend, they smacked the Swans by 39 points. They have beaten the top 3 teams, I believe, when it was at round 19, and that's really impressive from them. And that's why I've got them second. They've moved Rory Lobb back, and for the last 6 weeks, he's been really good. And they've now got Liam Jones back for the last couple games, and he has been very, very good for them, alongside Buku Kamas, who has performed pretty strongly. That 3 has now helped them, and Ed Richards has moved into the midfield. They trialled him when they lost Liberatore, and he performed really well. So putting him there now has allowed more freedom for Libba and Bond and Treloar, and they're all performing really well. And obviously their forward line has been in some great form. Norden has allowed Ugle-Hagan to break out into that number 1 star, and Cody Waitman brings a real spark to this team that a lot of their small forwards don't have, and that's why they're at number 2. And so that ends up with the number 1 spot, the most informed team in the competition, being the Brisbane Lions. Now, their last 4 games have been a 11-point win over the Adelaide Crows in a pretty solid performance, a 13-point win over West Coast after they had sacked their coach. So expecting a bounce back to get the win is still good enough. They beat the Swans by 2, and then they beat the Gold Coast Suns by 28. So not the most impressive stretch of form, but simply because they are 8-0 over the last 8 games, I have essentially not made an exception, but have taken that into account. Similar to Hawthorn, where their form hasn't been fantastic if you consider these 4 games. But because Brisbane are 8-0, I've considered them the most informed team of the competition. Without essentially a single key defender over the weekend against Gold Coast, they still got the win over them, and were able to place Eric Hipwood as a key defender. And given everyone else is performing so well, they were able to get the win. Their midfield, carried by Lockie Neal, Josh Dunkley, McInerney been fantastic in the ruck, Ashcroft when he's been back, McCluggage has been fantastic. They've all been exceptional. And then their forward line really got going. After it started poorly, as I mentioned, they needed to free it up, and they did, and they were able to get the win. Sorry, not get the win, but they were able to get some momentum going, and they haven't looked back since. I think they are potentially premiership favourites at the moment, because they could do a Geelong of 2022, where Geelong, I believe, won 13 in a row to win the flag. And if Brisbane go throughout the rest of the season without losing a game, that would be, I believe, 12 straight, and it'll only take 3 more to win 15 straight and do a very similar job. And so I see Brisbane as honestly my number 1 contenders at the moment and the most informed team of the competition. To now sort of look at the power rankings changes over the last 4 weeks, some of the biggest rises include Port Adelaide and GWS, both climbing by 7, Bulldogs climbing by 5, Geelong climbing by 4, St Kilda climbing by 4, and obviously Brisbane climbing by 3. You had 3 teams who didn't move at all, being Fremantle staying at 3, Melbourne staying at 10, and Adelaide staying at 14. And some of the biggest drops were between Sydney and Carlton, who both dropped by 7, Collingwood dropping by 7, Essendon dropping by 6, and Gold Coast dropping by 5. But that's going to be the end of this video. If you did like the video, please hit the like button. Really help push my video in the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to this channel as well if you like this type of content. And leave your thoughts in the comments below about you think your team has fared over the last 4 weeks. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.